Mayday! Both pilots unconscious. Maya Stevens, cockpit, NOV.
Emergency descent initiated. All passengers prepare for combat landing.
The engine exploded at 32,000 feet, metal shrapnel tearing through Flight 1247's hull as passengers screamed in terror. Oxygen masks dropped, emergency lights strobed, the aircraft spiraled toward Earth at 200 feet per second. "Mayday! Mayday! Both pilots unconscious!" James Rivera's voice cracked over the intercom as he sprinted toward seat 12A. "Maya Stevens, cockpit now!" "Are you insane?" a passenger shrieked. "She's just some artist." But Maya was already moving, not running, not panicking, flowing through the chaos with impossible calm. Her hands found emergency controls she shouldn't know existed. Her voice cut through the screaming with military precision. "Emergency descent initiated. All passengers prepare for combat landing." The executive's face went white. "Combat landing? Who is she?" Maya's fingers danced across instruments like a virtuoso pianist. Outside, the ground rushed up at terminal velocity. If you believe some people are born for moments like this, type "born ready" below. You have no idea what's coming. Maya Stevens, 28 years old, had occupied seat 12A in complete anonymity for the first 2 hours of American Airlines Flight 1247. Her presence was as unremarkable as her deliberately casual appearance. Wireless earbuds, sleek design tablet propped against the window, and the relaxed posture of someone either sketching digital concepts or reviewing creative portfolios. To her fellow passengers, she appeared to be exactly what her boarding pass suggested, a freelance graphic designer traveling between Dallas and Charlotte for client meetings. Her wardrobe reinforced this impression perfectly, an oversized art studio sweatshirt that concealed her athletic build, designer sneakers that suggested creative industry success, and the subtle confidence of someone comfortable working independently in digital creative fields. No military bearing was visible. No obvious physical training markers. No smartphone constantly buzzing with urgent communications like corporate executives. She simply existed in productive solitude, occasionally making precise stylus movements across her tablet screen, while noise-canceling earbuds kept her isolated from cabin conversation. American Airlines Flight 1247 had departed Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport exactly on schedule, bound for Charlotte Douglas with perfect weather conditions for the routine 2 5-hour journey. The Airbus A321 carried 145 passengers and 6 crew members through standard flight operations that should have concluded with normal approach procedures and gate arrival. Everything remained textbook normal for exactly 47 minutes after takeoff. The first indication of catastrophic failure came as a thunderous explosion that shook the aircraft's entire superstructure, a sound that experienced frequent flyers might mistake for severe turbulence, but which immediately triggered every alarm in Maya's subconscious training. The starboard engine had suffered complete containment failure, sending titanium fragments through critical hydraulic systems. Then the port engine began producing irregular power fluctuations, creating asymmetric thrust that sent the aircraft into an uncontrolled spiral. Cabin lights failed systematically as electrical systems overloaded. Passengers throughout the aircraft released collective screams of terror as the plane's stable flight characteristics transformed into a death spiral toward North Carolina farmland. Emergency oxygen masks deployed automatically while children's terrified crying mixed with adult prayers and panicked shouting. The aircraft dropped altitude at an alarming rate, triggering automatic emergency lighting along the aisles as cabin pressure warnings blared through speakers that most passengers couldn't hear over their own fear. From the cockpit, Captain Thompson's unconscious form slumped over primary flight controls, while First Officer Barnes struggled with oxygen deprivation, his hands fumbling ineffectively with backup systems he could no longer operate coherently. The intercom crackled with James Rivera's desperate voice. "Is there anyone aboard with flight experience? Anyone with aviation background?" Maya's reaction was immediate and impossibly calm. While 144 other passengers descended into panic, she closed her design tablet with practiced efficiency, secured it in the seat pocket, and stood with fluid motion that suggested muscle memory rather than conscious decision-making. Her movement through the chaos was purposeful and direct, not the desperate stumbling of someone trying to help beyond their capabilities, but the confident navigation of someone accessing familiar territory. "Ma'am, are you absolutely certain you can help?" James Rivera asked breathlessly as Maya approached the cockpit entrance, his voice carrying desperate hope mixed with professional skepticism about sending a civilian passenger into the aircraft's command center. "James Rivera, flight attendant, employee ID 47291. Maya responded with calm precision that froze him completely. "You've been with American Airlines for 8 years, 4 months. You completed emergency response training at Dallas Flight Training Center last November. Your protocol's manual section 12.7 covers passenger pilot emergency utilization." Rivera's eyes widened with shock. How could this random passenger know his employment history, training records, and specific protocol references that weren't public information? Maya continued past his stunned silence into the cockpit, where she began implementing emergency procedures with systematic precision that belonged in military training simulations, not civilian aircraft emergency responses. If you believe steady competence deserves respect, type respect in the comments. This gets more intense. The cockpit presented a scene of barely controlled catastrophe that would have overwhelmed most civilian volunteers. Captain Thompson remained unconscious across primary flight controls, his weight creating additional control surface complications. First Officer Barnes maintained minimal consciousness, but clearly suffered from hypoxia, his movements slow and uncoordinated as secondary life support systems had failed. Maya entered the cramped flight deck with confident familiarity that belonged in professional aviation environments, not passenger emergencies. Without hesitation, she reached across the instrument panel and disengaged the malfunctioning autopilot system that had been fighting against manual control inputs, immediately stabilizing the aircraft's erratic descent pattern. Her hands moved across instrument displays with fluid efficiency, systematically checking backup hydraulic pathways, emergency electrical redundancy systems, and manual flight control configurations. Every movement demonstrated intimate knowledge of Airbus A321 emergency protocols that civilian passengers shouldn't possess. "Ma'am, who exactly are you?" James Rivera asked, his voice carrying a mixture of amazement and growing suspicion as he watched Maya implement procedures with professional competence. "Maya Stevens," she responded matter-of-factly, while her hands continued working through complex emergency checklist sequences. "Former Air National Guard, 144th Fighter Wing, F-16 flight instructor specializing in emergency operations and combat aviation training. 5 years intensive crisis management, current civilian pilot certification with multi-engine commercial endorsement." Rivera's jaw dropped. "You're actually a qualified military pilot?" "At 32,000 feet with dual engine failure and unconscious crew," Maya replied, without shifting attention from critical aircraft systems assessment. "I'm the most qualified pilot you're going to find." Back in the passenger cabin, confused whispers were transforming into focused attention as words spread about the young woman who had appeared so ordinary during normal flight operations. A middle-aged business executive who had witnessed Maya's purposeful entry into the cockpit turned to nearby passengers with bewildered realization. "She's actually taking command of this aircraft," he whispered. His earlier skepticism completely evaporated. She knew the flight attendant's employee ID number and training history. How could a random passenger know that information? Maya was already establishing emergency communication protocols with systematic precision. She restored auxiliary power to critical navigation systems, established manual backup control for hydraulic flight surfaces, and engaged emergency descent procedures that would maintain controlled flight without functional engines. Using her knowledge of regional geography and prevailing atmospheric conditions, she calculated optimal emergency glide ratios that would carry them toward Charlotte Douglas International Airport while maximizing altitude retention and distance coverage over suitable emergency landing terrain. She's actually stabilizing our descent, James Rivera reported to the cabin crew with growing amazement. The aircraft is responding to her control inputs with precision I've never seen during passenger emergencies. Throughout the passenger compartment, the dismissive comments and skeptical jokes had completely disappeared, replaced by respectful silence as people began understanding that their survival depended entirely on the competence of someone they had dramatically underestimated based on superficial appearances. Maya's voice cut through cockpit chaos with professional authority as she established radio contact with air traffic control. Charlotte Tower, this is American Airlines Flight 1247 declaring emergency. Aircraft experiencing complete dual-engine failure with crew incapacitation. I am Maya Stevens, assuming pilot-in-command authority under emergency protocols. The primary air traffic controller at Charlotte Douglas froze at his station, his hand hovering over response controls as he processed the unprecedented situation unfolding over his frequency. Flight 1247, please confirm pilot identification and emergency authority before we proceed with clearance protocols. Before Maya could respond, a different voice interrupted the emergency frequency with unmistakable military command authority that immediately commanded attention throughout the control facility. Charlotte Tower, this is Colonel Sarah Mitchell, 144th Fighter Wing Operations. Maya Stevens is confirmed qualified for emergency command authority. Provide her with complete cooperation and unrestricted emergency support. She has my full authorization and the complete backing of Air National Guard emergency protocols. The control tower fell into momentary silence as controllers processed this extraordinary intervention from Military Aviation Command, then responded with the clearance that would determine whether 145 passengers and 6 crew members would survive the next 20 minutes. Flight 1247, you are cleared for unrestricted emergency approach. You have absolute priority for all airspace and runway access. Emergency crews are positioning for full response protocols. Maya's hands remained impossibly steady as she began the complex process of configuring the powerless Airbus A321 for what aviation professionals call a dead-stick landing, essentially a controlled crash that requires perfect execution to avoid catastrophic failure. She manually adjusted wing flap configurations to optimize lift-to-drag ratios, coordinated airspeed management using only gravitational energy, and calculated approach angles using backup instruments and visual reference points. The Charlotte Douglas runway complex became visible through the cockpit windscreen as Maya turned toward First Officer Barnes, who was struggling to maintain consciousness but following her emergency procedures with professional recognition of her extraordinary competence. First Officer Barnes, I need you to focus on breathing normally and monitoring our backup instruments, Maya instructed with calm authority. We're going to execute a textbook emergency landing, but I need you conscious to verify checklist completion. The aircraft's descent was masterfully controlled despite complete absence of engine power. Maya treated the massive Airbus like a precision glider, using every principle of aerodynamics and energy management she had developed during years of military aviation training under extreme pressure situations. Her radio communications remained professional and precise. Charlotte Tower, Flight 1247 approaching outer marker, emergency descent stable, passengers secured, crew prepared for emergency evacuation procedures. Requesting confirmation of runway emergency equipment positioning. Flight 1247, full emergency response is staged and ready. Fire rescue crews positioned along runway approach. Medical teams standing by. You are cleared for landing runway 18R. Winds calm, no traffic conflicts. Back in the passenger cabin, the transformation in atmosphere was remarkable. Passengers who had been experiencing panic just minutes earlier now watched the cockpit area with quiet confidence, understanding that their emergency was being managed by someone whose qualifications extended far beyond anything they could have imagined during normal boarding procedures. She's talking to air traffic control like a military commander. One passenger whispered to another. Her voice sounds like she's done this 100 times before. Look at how calm everyone's becoming, another observed. Even the flight attendants are following her instructions without question. Who talks to pilots like that? Maya's presence had completely transformed the cabin dynamic from desperate chaos to controlled emergency management, proving that exceptional competence often exists in the most unexpected places, waiting for circumstances that demand professional skill over superficial assumptions. The runway approached at exactly the optimal angle and airspeed that Maya had calculated for their aircraft weight and current atmospheric conditions. Every calculation demonstrated intimate knowledge of emergency landing physics that belonged in military test pilot programs, not civilian passenger aircraft situations. Charlotte Tower, Flight 1247 on final approach. All systems configured for emergency landing. Passengers and crew secured for impact. The moment of truth was approaching rapidly. Outside the cockpit windows, Charlotte Douglas International Airport's emergency response vehicles were positioned along the runway approach path. Fire trucks, ambulances, rescue equipment, and medical teams prepared for whatever outcome would unfold in the next 90 seconds. Maya's voice remained steady as she provided final status updates. Charlotte Tower. Flight 1247 touching down in 60 seconds. Emergency evacuation procedures will begin immediately upon aircraft stop. Request emergency medical assessment for 2 crew members with oxygen deprivation symptoms. Colonel Sarah Mitchell's voice crackled through the emergency frequency one final time. Maya, bring everyone home safely. In the passenger cabin, 145 people held their breath as the runway surface approached, their survival depending entirely on the steady hands of someone who had transformed from anonymous passenger to emergency commander in less than 15 minutes. The aircraft descended toward Charlotte Douglas Runway 18R with textbook precision that would be studied in aviation emergency training programs for years to come. Main landing gear contacted the runway surface at precisely 118 knots, dead center of the runway centerline with minimal vertical impact force that protected both aircraft structural integrity and passenger safety. Maya's execution was flawless. The aircraft touched down with the gentleness of a scheduled arrival rather than a catastrophic emergency landing. The Airbus A321 rolled smoothly down the runway, using only aerodynamic braking and mechanical wheel friction, coming to a complete stop approximately 2/3 down the runway length. Not a single passenger or crew member sustained injuries beyond minor stress-related symptoms. The emergency landing was textbook perfect. The moment aircraft engines spooled down and cabin doors opened, the tarmac filled with emergency responders, medical personnel, Federal Aviation Administration investigators, and media representatives who had monitored the dramatic emergency radio communications. But remarkably, nobody approached Maya requesting identification verification or credentials documentation. Every aviation professional present, from air traffic controllers to emergency response coordinators, simply nodded with the respect accorded to someone whose performance had demonstrated competence beyond any paperwork requirements. Ma'am, that was the most professional emergency landing I've witnessed in 30 years of air traffic control, the Charlotte Tower supervisor told Maya as she stepped onto the tarmac. Your radio work and approach execution were absolutely textbook. Colonel Sarah Mitchell arrived at Charlotte Douglas within 2 hours, not in official capacity, but as someone ensuring that Maya received appropriate recognition without unwanted publicity. The 2 women spoke briefly near the aircraft, their conversation professional but clearly indicating long-standing mutual respect. Maya, your performance today represents everything we trained for, Colonel Mitchell said quietly. 5 years of emergency instruction, combat readiness programs, and crisis management training, all of it came together perfectly when lives depended on execution rather than theory. Colonel, I was just doing what needed to be done, Maya replied with characteristic humility. 145 people needed to get home safely today. Everything else was just following procedures we've practiced 1,000 times. Following procedures? Colonel Mitchell smiled. Maya, you improvised solutions that most commercial pilots couldn't execute with full engine power and conscious crew. You turned a catastrophic failure into a routine arrival. The conversation revealed layers of Maya's background that explained her impossible competence during the emergency. Her Air National Guard service included specialization in emergency operations training, where she had served as primary instructor for combat aviation crisis management. Her civilian career as a graphic designer was legitimate but secondary to maintaining her military aviation qualifications. The 144th Fighter Wing has a standing policy, Colonel Mitchell explained to curious airport officials. Our pilots maintain currency and readiness even during civilian career periods. Maya's qualifications never lapsed because her service commitment extends beyond active duty requirements. Maya's training records, when examined by FAA investigators, revealed extraordinary competence development. She had logged instructor hours in F-16 emergency procedures, completed advanced multi-engine certification training, and maintained current knowledge of commercial aircraft systems through voluntary continuing education programs. Most military pilots specialize in single aircraft types, the lead FAA investigator noted. Maya's training included cross-platform emergency procedures covering civilian aircraft systems. Her knowledge base spans military and commercial aviation protocols. Her performance during Flight 1247's emergency wasn't exceptional luck or natural talent. It was the direct result of intensive preparation for exactly these circumstances. The 144th Fighter Wing's Emergency Instruction Program required pilots to maintain proficiency in civilian aircraft emergency procedures specifically for situations where military aviation expertise might be needed in civilian contexts. We train for the scenarios that never happen, Colonel Mitchell explained, until they do happen, and then we're grateful for every hour of preparation that seemed unnecessary until lives depended on it. Media coverage of the incident focused primarily on the dramatic nature of the emergency rather than the specific qualifications of the person who had prevented catastrophic loss of life. Television footage showed blurry images of Maya stepping down aircraft stairs, hood pulled up, eyes focused straight ahead, moving with the same unremarkable composure she had maintained throughout the crisis. To casual observers, she appeared to be just another passenger grateful to have survived a frightening experience. But within military aviation communities and professional pilot networks, her name began circulating with the kind of respect reserved for individuals whose competence had been demonstrated under the most demanding circumstances possible. Comments appeared on restricted aviation forums, accessible only to certified military and commercial pilots. Maya Stevens used to be our emergency procedures instructor at the 144th. Her simulation scores were legendary. Dead stick landing an A321 with passengers. That's something most of us practice in simulators, but pray we never execute for real. She didn't leave military service because of dissatisfaction. She just stopped needing to prove herself to anyone. The aviation community had quietly acknowledged that some people earn their place in the sky through demonstrated competence rather than bureaucratic credentials, and that the most valuable qualifications are those proven under pressure when lives depend on performance rather than paperwork. 1 week after the emergency landing, Maya discovered an envelope delivered to her Charlotte apartment, not through normal postal service, but hand-delivered by someone with access to her personal information through military channels. The correspondence wasn't from American Airlines, FAA investigators, or media representatives seeking interviews about her heroic actions. Instead, it contained a brief handwritten note on official 144th Fighter Wing letterhead. Maya, some pilots fly with regulatory authorization and standard operating procedures. You fly with something more valuable, absolute competence and unshakable performance under pressure. You're cleared for any airspace, any time, any conditions. Respectfully, Colonel Sarah Mitchell. The note included a second document that Maya hadn't expected: permanent authorization for priority flight services across all commercial airlines operating in the United States. Her name had been quietly added to a restricted database, accessible only to airline operations managers and air traffic control supervisors, a database containing individuals whose aviation competence had been verified through extraordinary circumstances. This wasn't publicity or media recognition. This was professional acknowledgement within aviation communities that understood the difference between paperwork qualifications and demonstrated competence under pressure. Maya's performance during Flight 1247 had earned her something more valuable than news coverage, permanent respect from people who understood exactly what she had accomplished. Her civilian career as a graphic designer continued normally, but with an interesting development. Corporate clients began approaching her specifically because of her reputation for calm competence under pressure, a reputation that had somehow spread through professional networks without any direct connection to the emergency landing incident. "We need someone who can manage complex projects when everything goes wrong," one Fortune 500 client explained during a contract negotiation. "Your references all mention the same thing. You perform best when situations become impossible." Maya never discussed the flight emergency in business contexts, but her approach to design challenges reflected the same systematic problem-solving that had saved 151 lives at 32,000 feet. She treated deadline crises and technical complications with the same calm precision she had applied to emergency aviation procedures. However, she did notice remarkable changes in her subsequent commercial flight experiences. Every time she booked airline tickets for business or personal travel, Seat 12A mysteriously remained available. Never assigned to other passengers, never blocked for operational reasons, never unavailable due to overbooking or aircraft configuration changes. Flight crews seemed to recognize her name during check-in procedures, though they maintained professional protocols while ensuring she received expedited security clearance and priority boarding privileges. Gate agents would provide upgraded services without being asked, and air traffic controllers at various airports began recognizing her voice during private pilot communications. "The aviation community is smaller than most people realize," Colonel Mitchell explained during one of their occasional dinners. "Word travels quickly when someone demonstrates the kind of competence you showed during Flight 1247. People remember performance like that." Maya's instructor role at the 144th Fighter Wing evolved to include civilian aircraft emergency procedures training, where she developed programs teaching military pilots how to assist in commercial aviation emergencies. Her curriculum became the standard for cross-platform emergency response training across multiple Air National Guard wings. "What Maya accomplished wasn't just individual heroism," Colonel Mitchell told her wing commanders. "She proved that our training programs work when applied to civilian emergency situations. Her performance validates everything we've been teaching about adaptability and crisis management." The Federal Aviation Administration quietly incorporated details of Maya's emergency procedures into their training materials for commercial airline pilots, though her name was kept confidential. Her dead-stick landing techniques became case study material in aviation colleges and flight training programs worldwide. "This is how professional aviators respond when training meets crisis," became the standard comment in academic discussions of her emergency landing. Perfect execution under impossible circumstances, with outcomes that prove the value of intensive preparation for scenarios that might never happen. Maya's story spread through military aviation networks not as dramatic publicity, but as professional education. Young pilots studying emergency procedures learned about the Stevens approach, systematic problem-solving under extreme pressure, with focus on successful outcomes rather than heroic gestures. 6 months after Flight 1247, Maya received a call from the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum requesting permission to include her emergency landing in their aviation safety exhibit. She declined the publicity but agreed to provide technical details for educational purposes, maintaining her preference for competence over recognition. "Some stories need to be told," she explained to Colonel Mitchell. "But the people don't need to become celebrities. The important thing is that other pilots learn from what worked." The quiet transformation in Maya's life reflected a broader phenomenon within professional aviation communities. Her emergency landing had created ripple effects that extended far beyond the immediate rescue of 151 people. It had demonstrated the ongoing value of maintaining military aviation expertise within civilian contexts. Other Air National Guard wings began implementing similar cross-training programs, ensuring their pilots maintained currency in civilian aircraft emergency procedures. The 144th Fighter Wing's training model became the template for multi-platform emergency response preparation across the entire Air National Guard system. Maya's performance proved that our people can make a difference in civilian emergencies, Air National Guard leadership noted in their annual training assessment. Her competence under pressure validates our investment in comprehensive emergency training that extends beyond military-specific scenarios. Commercial airlines quietly began reaching out to military aviation commands, establishing informal consultation protocols for scenarios requiring extraordinary expertise. Maya's emergency landing had opened communication channels between civilian and military aviation communities that had previously operated in relative isolation. Within the graphic design industry, Maya's reputation for impossible deadline management and crisis project recovery led to consulting opportunities with major corporations facing complex technical challenges. Her systematic approach to problem-solving, developed through military aviation training, proved valuable in business contexts that had nothing to do with flying aircraft. She approaches design challenges like they're life-or-death situations, one client explained to colleagues. Her process is so methodical and calm that impossible projects become manageable. We don't know her background, but she definitely has experience with high-pressure performance. Maya maintained her dual identity carefully. Respected graphic designer in civilian contexts, available aviation expert when emergencies demanded military-level competence. She never sought publicity for either role, preferring to let performance speak louder than credentials or self-promotion. The aviation community's quiet recognition continued expanding. Airport security personnel began recognizing her name, providing expedited clearance without explanation. Pilot lounges at major airports would accommodate her during layovers, though she never requested special treatment. Air traffic controllers at airports nationwide knew to provide her with efficient routing and priority clearance when she flew private aircraft. There's an unofficial network of people who know when competence matters more than paperwork, Colonel Mitchell observed. Maya's name circulates among professionals who understand the difference between qualifications and demonstrated capability. Her story became legend within military aviation training programs, though always told professionally rather than dramatically. New pilots learned about maintaining currency across platforms and preparing for scenarios that seem unlikely until they become critical. 2 years after Flight 1247, Maya received an invitation to speak at the Air Force Academy about civilian-military aviation integration. She accepted, on the condition that her presentation focus on training methodology rather than personal heroism. The important lesson isn't what one person accomplished, she told the Academy cadets. The important lesson is that proper training works when lives depend on performance. Focus on preparation, not recognition. Her final message to the next generation of military aviators reflected the same philosophy that had guided her through emergency landing procedures. Competence doesn't need announcement. When circumstances demand excellence, execution is the only thing that matters. Thank you for typing respect. Maya's story proves that true strength operates quietly until crisis demands action. Subscribe for more stories where competence conquers chaos. Support our mission. Buy Me Coffee link in the pinned comment. Until next time, steady hands change everything.